Hello. Well, I'm back in Canada again. I suppose there might be some people watching this in the UK who think I'm not dealing enough with matters in the UK, but this stuff going on over across the Atlantic is so important, and it's actually a rather British subject as well, but I'll get to that in a minute. I think this really will mark a change in a whole lot of things, some of them good, some of them possibly not so good, but then, you know, that always happens with change, doesn't it? The headline I'm going to read to you now is from the Associated Press. US urges Canada to use federal powers to end the bridge blockade. Just think of it this way. One country is telling another country to get its act together. It's actually telling this other country they have to do something to do with their own work practices. Can you think of anything more presumptuous than that? Than the US getting involved? They're going to give their help, they said, you know, like they did in Vietnam or Afghanistan possibly. Just imagine one country telling another country to use any law it can to end a workers' strike so that they can sell more cars. Can you think of the rudeness of it? Aren't you guys in America, even the ones who don't support the strike, don't you feel just a little bit uncomfortable with that? And where are the howls of outrage from the workers-supporting, bike-pedalling Guardian? Oh, of course, silly question. Truckers are so terribly common, aren't they? According to the papers, the reason for the USA telling Trudeau to squash his workers is so that they can proceed with the USA's economic recovery. So they're telling Canada, they're telling Canadians, get to work so we can get our money back. Undoubtedly, Biden's team is worried that the economic halt which is being created by those trucks blocking bridges is going to affect the midterms. They're not worried about the economic recovery, they're worried about the vote. And of course, this could have an effect even on the next election. But it's not only that, is it? It's because the Canadians are showing the USA how to do a decently effective protest. Now, I was very much against the people blocking the roads in Britain, you know, when they were sitting in the motorway. But this, I'm just mentioning this because I want to mention the difference. This is a workers' collective getting together to ask for a restrictive law to be dropped. The ones we had in Britain were a bunch of people, not necessarily workers' collective, but they were trying to insist that the government put in laws that they wanted to put in. You see, there's a difference. And the MSM, of course, is shouting at the Canadians right now for demonstrating for their rights. And they had hardly a word to say about the protests in the US inner cities, did they? And that's because the riots in the American cities weren't for rights. They were just expressions of rage. Or, as I said, in Britain, an attempt to bulldoze the government into putting some legislation in which the rest of the country hadn't voted for. But let's get back to America. The rioters destroyed their own environments. And what did the elite care if the black people in the projects didn't have shops anymore or tidy living environments, because that would work to their advantage? These people will become more impoverished and make them even more reliant on government handouts. And that's why the riots in the American cities didn't get the sort of fury that we're seeing from CNN. If in America the respectable lower wage earners got together, just like the Canadian truckers, and simply blocked the economy because they refused to fetch and run for the elites, then the elite's going to be in trouble, isn't it? And they're getting really worked up about this. They absolutely cannot have that example show any sort of success. Trudeau has promised his bosses in the USA that he will do, and it says, whatever it takes to get the truckers off the bridges. Everything, that is, except acceding to the truckers' reasonable requests that the vaccine and mask mandates, which other countries have dropped, so it's hardly an outlandish request. So they're asking that this should be dropped for Canada as well, which is reasonable. Instead, the Trudeau government has got the police confiscating fuel and wood and anything else that the truckers need to keep themselves warm. They've threatened to confiscate the truckers' children. The judges have actually tried to freeze the flow of funds. And shame on you, Canadian police and judicial system. You are acting disgracefully, and someday you're going to very much regret your compliance with this sort of tyranny. However, I have news for you. Even if all the truckers went home this very minute, it has made a change, and I'm going to show you why by delving into history. I suppose some of you will have heard of the Peasants' Revolt. It happened in 1381, which was some time ago. But history does, well, you know, they say, may not repeat, but it certainly rhymes. And most things in those days took longer to develop. So it arose out of a pandemic, just like this one did. In this case, or in that case rather, it was the Black Death. Around the 1340s. That's what I mean about slow, because it took 40 years before the momentum gathered. About in the 1340s, when the Black Death hit, about a third of every human being in England died of the plague. That's a huge amount of the population. It caused tremendous social disruption, not least of which was the lack of peasants to work the land. After the plague had died down, whole estates found themselves with fewer workers, and these fewer workers started to, well, get a little bit above themselves. They started to think that perhaps since there was such a shortage of them, they could ask for higher wages. The government decided they couldn't ask for higher wages and tried to peg the wages to the same rate as before the upheaval. They also passed laws restricting the peasants' right to move from one place to another, you know, one farm to another, for better employment prospects. And they also told them they couldn't wear the sort of fancy clothes that their aristocratic betters got to wear. In other words, the government tried to keep the peasants in their place, quite literally, and surrounded them with restrictive laws. Does that sound familiar? Then the king happened to have a spat with France. The two countries went to war, and the government suddenly needed more money for an army. And the peasants decided at that point that was enough. The taxes went on. They were confined at home. They didn't want the restrictions. They didn't want the taxes, and they wanted an end to serfdom. Well, it was quite a violent thing. They killed a few people. They threatened the social order. And in the end, the government managed to overcome them because they were a bit better organised and militarily trained. And they killed off their leaders and some innocents as well, of course. And everything went back to normal. Well, no, it didn't. Because the Peasants' Revolt had given the government a serious jolt. Serfdom did atrophy. Taxes of that sort were never levied again. And most of the restrictive laws were quietly dropped or, ignored, honoured more in the breach than in the observance. This revolt will make a similar difference, except it won't take so much time. However, I do have one warning. It will take a few years, but I can see both governments in North America and probably the rest of the world putting far more resources into the development of self-driving vehicles, especially with regard to delivery trucks. I'd say that trucking jobs will be safe for a while, but I don't see it as a long-term prospect anymore. This has been too much of a lesson for the governments. But whatever, even if all the truckers go home this very minute, their courage, their unity, their commitment are not only an example to us all, but a warning to all governments in the West that they can only push the ordinary people so far, and this effect will be felt for years to come. Right on, truckers. And I have been Grannyopteryx. I am on YouTube, Rumble, BitChute and Minds, and I do appreciate it if you click the like button. If you support my channel, that's nice. I had a couple of people recently supporting very generously, and I'm very grateful, really, because these videos are a fair amount of work. And yeah, just check your subscription, because sometimes your subscription seems to drop out of the algorithm somewhere. Until next time. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and t-shirts come in the Grannyopteryx design or Granbo with a firearm or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.grannyopteryx.com and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share, share, share.